Hey, everybody. Please take your seats. And my colleague, my partner, Tina, and I have been doing the Sarah and Tina show, pretty much all week long. So she's going to perform right now and welcome you to our closing plenary session.
Thank you, Sarah. I don't have a performance planned, and I know that brevity is the soul of wit, so I will keep it very brief and turn it over to our panelists. But we just wanted to say thank you so much, everyone.
No, turn it over to me first.
And first to Sarah. But thank you, everyone, very much for joining us here this week. It's the third day. It's the afternoon of the third day. I know you're all probably starting to get a little tired, and we're really excited that you're still here and still engaged. We'd love to welcome you for a closing drink after the panel and a chance to chat with everyone a bit more upstairs in the grand ballroom. With that, I'll turn it over to Sarah Demme.
So this is an event that we've done for now 4 years in a row. Is it 4 or 5 years? Our media roundup, heard around the square in the Imperial Ballroom here. This is our final plenary session. It follows our very lively discussion on Monday about politics and the election and what's going to happen to our industry, which really got very lively, followed by a discussion about pricing, followed today about the financing market. And we're looking forward to hearing from those that cover the activity in our space about what they've heard around the square, so to say, during this week. I did admonish everybody to remember that we're at Biotech Showcase during JPM Week. So Biotech Showcase, they will remember, they will talk about hearing everything, all the new news at Biotech Showcase. I turned it over to Jeff Kramer to enforce that. Jeff is with executive editor at BioCentury. A note for housekeeping purposes, we do have 2 stand-up mics. You will be invited to ask questions. We do ask you to ask a question and not make statements or commentaries and whatever else, and we will chaperone that. So with that said, Jeff?
Thank you.
The panel is yours.
Excellent. Well, there has been some murmuring around the hallways of the Biotech Showcase that it's been an unusually quiet week. It's certainly been unusually sunny for those of you who have been here in past years. But that's not to say there hasn't been a lot to talk about. There's quite a lot to catch up on across M&A, new co-launches, and up-and-coming therapies, and we certainly have the panel here to engage in a lively discussion about all that. So first, I'd like to have everyone introduce themselves, and then we'll get going. Along the way, we do have mics up. Feel free to jump up if you have a question, and we'll work you into the conversation. Only if you have a question. Okay, Andrew.
Hi, everyone. I'm Andrew Dunn. I'm a reporter with Biopharma Dive in DC. We cover the pharma and biotech space.
Hi, I'm Riley Griffin. I'm a reporter with Bloomberg News. I cover large cap pharmaceutical companies like Merck and J&J.
Hi, I'm Matthew Herper. I'm a senior writer and editorial director of events at STAT, and I write about medicine.
I am Mandy Jackson. I'm the U.S. managing editor for commercial news for Scrip and the Pink Sheet.
And I'm Erin McAllister. I am senior editor at BioCentury and head of clinical development and market access. I had to pause and remember it for some reason. And I'm glad to be here at Biotech Showcase. Nailed it.
Excellent.
Well done.
Thanks.
You stuck the landing.
This should be a drinking game every time we say biotech.
I like that version
That's
of
a
the
good
panel.
call. Is there some champagne around that we can engage in?
How to get reporters to say Biotech Showcase.
Gold stars, we'll take it. All right, well, I'd like to kick things off with a conversation about M&A, or as Matt said to me as I walked in, lack thereof. Last year, as the Biotech Showcase got underway, we had already had the $8 billion Loxo deal and the $74 billion Celgene takeout in the books. It's been very quiet on the M&A front this week. I think the biggest upfront payment we've seen is maybe the MorphoSys deal at $900 million. What does the lack of headline deals say, if anything, about the state of M&A going into the year? Riley?
Yeah, so I think I've heard a lot of chatter that I'm sure you have, which is about lofty valuations and potentially political uncertainty. But large cap pharma seems to suggest that last year they bit off a lot. You saw mega mergers, but you also saw transformational spin-offs. You saw Pfizer Upjohn getting rid of their off-patent drug unit, lots of consumer health spin-offs. You also saw animal health spin-offs. And then companies like Sanofi saying that they are taking a different direction. I had a conversation just earlier today with GSK's David Redfern, and he said this is how the system should work. Sometimes we move, we transform, and then we reset. And just because we're not seeing those mega merger deals this week isn't to say that bolt-ons won't continue throughout the year.
Interesting. Anyone else here hear any?
Well, I've been talking to a lot of companies as well about what their business development strategy is, and they're saying, well, we're buyers, we're definitely out there. I think the appetite for the large mega deals is not there, however, but we'll still see a lot of pretty significant partnering deals going forward from what I'm hearing. Nobody's not buying. They're all out there looking.
Yeah, I mean, if you look at Pfizer and Novartis as two examples of they have the capacity probably to do a significant, massive deal, but they publicly stated recently that they don't really have that interest. So,
But Array wasn't that long ago. Medco and Synthorix just happened. I'd be careful about overinterpreting a limited amount of data. But on the other hand, while my big pharma sources say, oh no, it's not the election and we're going to buy, my VC sources are worried the exit window's closing. So maybe that's a little more sensitive than, because the big pharmas always say, usually they say they're not going to buy anything to keep prices from going up. So,
yeah, it's a good point, Matt. But we did in the fourth quarter we did see 5 deals over $1 billion. So it's the farmers have not been asleep at the wheel, to be sure, in the big biotechs.
And I just want to pick up on, me, Jeff,
jump in there,
Aaron. Pick up on what Riley said about a lot of mega mergers last year. I think the other thing to look out for this year is I don't know if there'll be more M&A, but the digestion of those. When you have mega mergers, something always gets cast off. Things get cast off. Obviously, Otezla went to Amgen just to get the Celgene BMS deal done. But I don't expect, it's quite possible you might see programs get spun out licensed from that. I think the other thing on the big pharma side in terms of the spin-outs that Pfizer announced last year, we've been seeing that for a while now. Novartis did it, has been going through it for several years. You could argue it started when BMS sold off its Mead Johnson nutrition business, almost a decade ago maybe. And so I think there the question is more, who's left? Who's left to cast off on the big pharma side, consumer products and other sorts that aren't innovative drugs.
So following up on that, who might be the likely takeout targets this year? Or who might be on the prowl? In other words, which company won't be here next year?
So I think if you look at companies, that have new CEOs, pharmas that have new CEOs, they're going to be, I think, out there doing deals. Sanofi, for example. So that's just one potential buyer in my mind. So.
TKI makers always make nice bolt-ons, tyrosine kinase inhibitor makers.
I'm personally curious about an appetite for NASH deals. I think there's a lot of remaining interest in metabolic and anti-fibrotic NASH drugs, and we keep waiting for those to happen, especially with one like Intercept, which is closest to market. But Big Pharma is skeptical, and there are a lot of market access questions there and pricing questions that remain, and so we might see that drug come to market first and watch it pave the way before a Lilly makes a deal for a drug like that.
Sounds good. Were there any deals this week that caught your eye as particularly interesting? Andrew?
This week? Not so much.
We'll give you last Friday.
I'd go to last Friday, and I would take Eli Lilly Dermira. I think that was an interesting acquisition. They already have Taltz. It gives them, what seems to be a competitor in a very competitive space when you look at atopic dermatitis with Dupixent. To see how that plays out with phase 3 data, I think it's going to be really interesting. And Lilly's a very formidable commercialization power that I think gives Sanofi and Regeneron a good test on Dupixent.
Sounds good. Anyone else?
Well, I think a space to watch is going to be these earlier deals. The pharma companies are feeling pretty good about their pipelines right now, for the most part. So they have a little leeway with what they're doing. They still need to fill their early pipelines, and there's a lot out there to buy. Why not buy those? Although if you ask them, they're telling their investors they want to do the later stage deals because they want to get more commercial products in their portfolios. So, but generally they're saying we want to buy across the spectrum. But the early stage deals, I mean, we're seeing the companies do them. We're seeing Roche do tons of them. They did 80 deals last year, more than 80 deals last year. And a lot of those were really early companies. So there's a lot of potential for deal making.
Yeah, I think another space to watch for deal making is CNS. You know, I think that some pharma companies are very much in it. Roche is one of them. And there's some data, I believe, this year for a company called Sage that could, you know, make them a takeout target. You know, people are watching their depression trials very closely. So that would be my only guess.
I'd like to turn to new company launches. There was perhaps the biggest piece of news, or the most disruptive piece of news this week, was the debut of Alexis Boris's new company, EQRx, which is aiming to offer innovative drugs at radically lower prices. Matt, I know you wrote a piece on that. What does this company need to do to succeed, and does it put the sector on notice? What have you been hearing since?
Well, the thing that I think actually puts the sector on notice about EQRx, and I heard it from some other people who aren't doing it as publicly as Alexis, but that there is a contingent of drug developers who are uncomfortable with the current pricing model. And I think even if you don't believe in EQRx, having someone like Alexis who, you know, I've known for 20 years through a whole bunch of companies that he started that were all aligned with pharma, essentially. You know, that is something worth noting. It's going to be an interesting thing. He said at our event Monday night that it was going to be that they're going to need to raise a total of $2 to $5 billion in capital. So even though they raised $200 million, it's really just kind of a seed round. And the idea is that they're going to take drugs that are on the market, or I'd imagine perhaps approaching the market, and make, you know, a Levitra to their Viagra. But this time these drugs will sell because the payers are so sick of prices that they'll be willing to do things to get access. It's a seller solution for a buyer problem, but it'll be interesting. One thing I thought was really interesting about the story is a lot of people, both on social media and personally, responded to it to me. And it's such an emotionally resonant thing for people in the industry. A lot of people hated it. I mean, it's worth reading Derek Lowe's post. It's always worth reading Derek. A lot of people loved it. A lot of people said it's great that Alexis is being this disruptive. I talked to someone who made them sad because they said, this is a guy who should be working on brand new mechanisms and things that have never happened before. And here he's going to spend years building a thing to do what's already been done. But it definitely, as a story, it had that kind of, which, you know, as a writer, it makes anyone who's involved in this business have feelings.
I have an anecdote to add to that. One of the more emotional responses I've seen was in a conversation with Eli Lilly's David Ricks. He said to me that the idea was naive at best. And I think he falls into the category of one of the drug makers that's uncomfortable with the current pricing dynamic. Lilly introduced a half-price insulin and has seen a number of PBMs and their health plans not cover that lower list price product. So his point was, we've tried to lower the prices of products and haven't seen that work. And to think that you can do this in this form is naive.
And I know Alexis' response to that, because and what he said, I've heard him say more than once now to that kind of response, is that you can't do this if you're in the pharma business. And one thing I kept asking him is, so let's say you're doing this and you get Lipitor to somebody's Zocor. Are you really not going to raise the price? Are you really going to be cheaper if you're better? And he said that he thinks because of the way they're going to have to build the company, which it's going to be so connected to the payer environment, that the company needs DNA. I mean, that question goes along, what if you're not there, Alexis, right? It's not just the commitment. Companies have lives. He said that he thinks if you build a company to do that, that's very different from trying to do it as a large pharmaceutical company.
Yeah, the other thing that we talked about, they recognize that companies are only one part of the system. You can set your price, like Lilly did, offer a lower list price, and because of the existing system where rebates are, you won't get it. You won't get it. People won't buy it. PBMs won't put you on their formulary. And I presented that to him, giving the example of biosimilars, both him and Melanie in my discussions, and he said, we get it. We will have partnerships, and we will be announcing partnerships very soon, perhaps, with some of these other, sort of cogs in the system, so that it's not just the lower list price. They get that. You have to bring others along with you. And then in terms of the fact that they're starting from the ground up, building a leaner system where you don't have huge field forces is the other, sort of element to this. So collaboration and leaner are two of the ways they hope to get at that. Will it work? I don't know, And Peter Bach is on their advisory board, and I think that's a good start. So we'll see.
Sounds good. Changing gears. Cancer therapies often steal the headlines and the spotlight. What other disease spaces are you watching for this year? Andrew?
Yeah, I was going to say neuroscience as well.
Neuroscience?
That struck me as one of the most surprising things I heard was Roche's Bill Anderson, the CEO of the pharmaceutical division. He said, quote, on stage, we think neuroscience has the potential to be in the 2020s what oncology has been to the last decade. And that's something I think, Matt Herbert, you actually pointed this out on Twitter, is something we've heard before when you think of the 1990s and the 2000s.
I heard it from Beth Seidenberg just a few hours ago. So a lot of people are saying it.
Yeah, I mean,
that it's the next, that they're interested, especially because a lot of the big pharmas are getting out. I also wrote a story saying that 3 or 4 years ago, and it sort of happened. But so I guess I'm ambivalent.
Because I asked Neurocrine CEO Kevin Gorman just a little bit ago about that statement. Obviously, they're strongly invested in CNS as well as Roche, so they have an interest in making this case. But they do see it as the lessons we've learned in oncology as far as precision medicine and taking a disease and breaking it down with using the genotype. That can be a powerful tool that can be applied to CNS diseases. And that made me think of talking with ALS researcher Merit Kudkowitz at Mass General. She said with ALS is a great example. We don't know if that's one disease or 30 diseases right now. And when we figure that out and we break it down, we have a little more info about genotype and some more genetic data, there could be some breakthroughs coming in neuroscience. But obviously it's an exceedingly hard field, and that statement has been proven wrong in previous decades. But I thought that was interesting.
We still don't have hard biomarkers for most of these diseases, though, which I think is the real, so long as you're using a series of questions on a survey to measure whether the drug's working. I think if neurofilament works for Alzheimer's, that could potentially be a very big deal, a diagnostic.
We have some successes, so that's what's helping with the momentum right now. I mean, you're right, 3 or 4 years ago, Biogen and Celgene were really banging the drum that it's time for neuroscience, it's our time, we're gonna make it happen, and now we're seeing Biogen's doing well, and with their newer drug, their SMA drug, and there's more coming in SMA. There are other indications that have had drugs do well. Roche is really interested because Ocrevus does so well. Ocrevus, I never say it right.
How do you say it?
You just got to spell it right.
Yeah, exactly.
Right. That's what I tell everyone.
So, Roche is doing well in this space. They're going to do more. They're investing a lot. Their neuroscience business development lead tells me they've got lots more to do and lots of interest. They're pretty much interested in everything except for epilepsy and another one that I can't remember right now. They're looking at almost everything in neuroscience.
I have a different answer to that question.
Okay.
I think cardiovascular is the space to watch this year. And I think it's a tale of two cities. One is about incremental benefit in the medicine space. The other is about commercial access. But as we've seen over the last 5 years, PCSK9 inhibitors have struggled to get to patients. They have not produced the sales that Big Pharma has really wanted. Yet simultaneously, Novartis just made almost $10 billion deal for the medicines company, which has a differentiated product twice a year, could be a real game changer. And then there are other blockbuster drugs. Eliquis at BMS is still a mainstay, but are we going to see that incremental therapy simultaneously get reimbursed in a way that incentivizes Big Pharma to keep putting money down? I would watch out for cardiovascular.
Right. Amgen's a company that, as a matter of fact, has given up on neuroscience for the most part and is bulking up in cardiovascular. They've got some important readouts this year. I wouldn't be surprised to see them do some significant business development at some point in that space.
I would just, since we are at Biotech Showcase, are there points awarded for that, by the way? Okay, all right, just want to be sure.
Who's leading?
It's always my goal. It's always a contest. I would say on the biotech side, I would be looking more towards hematology, so the sickle cell space, the hemophilia space, the thalassemia space, right? That's an area where we're going to see new drugs launched. We have seen new drugs in sickle cell launched already, one from a pharma and one from a biotech, and we're going to see, gene therapy and hemophilia perhaps this year from a biotech, right? Pretty sure, yeah. So, and so I think it's, bringing it back to biotech, I do believe this is the year of, in the decade of CNS, our buy-side story said as much that ran at the start of Biotech Showcase. But I also think that I'll be watching the sickle cell, hemophilia, and thalassemia space closely.
Well, and cardiovascular is always an area I watch. It's been one of my favorites up and down. But it's also generally a very hard place for, since we're at Biotech Showcase, I have to at least say it once and I'll forget it. But it's a hard space for biotechs to play in. I am very interested to see what happens with Verve, which is the company founded by Seth Thierson, using CRISPR in gene therapy in biotech, which sounds, in cardiovascular rather, which sounds almost crazy. But there has been this real, we really are starting to understand the genetics there in a way that's not true for most diseases. And we understand the mechanisms in, at least in myocardial infarction and stroke, better than a lot of other things in medicine. We still don't really understand sudden cardiac death.
Changing gears a little bit, favorite Biotech Showcase Healthcare Week story that you've had this year or a prior year?
Getting all of you to say Biotech Showcase repeatedly.
There we go.
I've got one. This is back to the conversation I was having with Dave Ricks. I took him to the Equality Lounge at the Westin. I will not say who hosted it there. And we were talking about this dynamic about insulins and getting reimbursement and coverage. And Larry Merlo was in the corner of the room. And mind you, this is like a girl power, Equality Lounge. And it's Ricks and Merlo and me. But David went over and approached Larry Merlo and said, I know we've had our differences in the past, and proceeded to address this very question of reimbursement and getting a lower list price product on formulary. So it was a very visual example of a industry question, which is how are big pharma and the insurance powers that be at neck and neck trying to get products to patients in an affordable and accessible way.
I've got one that's a little lighter. I'm not going to say Biotech Showcase here, because this would never happen at Biotech Showcase.
Sneaky like that.
So we wanted a curtain raiser for JP Morgan, and we didn't have any ideas. So I did the thing I usually do, which is I said, well, let's write a long history. So we looked back over 20 years of JP Morgan. And one of my favorite stories is Art Levinson from Genentech getting up at JP Morgan during the financial crisis. Everyone's a little testy, and I guess Art was too. And he pointed out, he said, I wasn't going to say this, but, and he points out that the DNA molecule on the JP Morgan materials is left-handed. And he said, we're a $250 billion industry. We should at least get the structure of DNA right. And so across the square, there's a billboard for a UK, come do biotech in the UK. Left-handed DNA. So that's my JP Morgan moment for this year.
I'll go with like an equally shallow, not shallow. Mine's gonna be shallow. That was great. But this is my first biotech showcase, so it's a limited pool I'm picking from. But I'll just go with a moment I saw today that I thought was particularly sort of sums it up. I'll use JPM here because it was the JPM breakout session for Amarin, which is obviously a huge takeout target on a lot of Wall Street analysts' lists. There was a lot of questions that were, getting at that as far as what are your commercialization plans, how are you going to take this blockbuster heart drug to market, and their CEO John Thoreau was defending it through that. He's a very steady, even-keeled, straight edge, narrow type of guy. And at the end, there was just a couple minutes left over, and he just kind of looks out, and I've never seen him do this before, just talking to him a couple times. But he just started talking with the audience. He goes, did any of you take Vascepa? Anyone out there on Vascepa? And he said, you should all talk to your doctors. He goes, I'm on Vascepa. I think some of you could also be on Vascepa. And that's how that breakout session ended. So,
Good sales force.
yeah, he's one of them, one of 800.
How about you, Mandy? I know you've had a few rodeos over the years.
Well, yeah, and it's Wednesday at JP Morgan, and I can barely remember what I wrote this week. But
It's Wednesday?
Yeah. We made it, Matt. We're here.
Oh, God. That suggests it's over. It's not.
I'm sorry. It's
You're
Wednesday at the Biotech Showcase. My favorite. I have to say right now that my favorites are going to be the stories that I'm going to write when I leave here and I have time to go through my notes, because I had some really fantastic interviews with companies about what they're doing, both from the big pharma side and from the small company side. And I'm really encouraged by progress that the industry is making in terms of the drugs that they're developing and attitudes about what works for patients and what doesn't work for patients. And I'm happy that that's getting to be more and more part of the conversation. I always talk about my mom when I talk about to people about immunology, because she's one of those arthritis patients that's refractory to everything at this point. So, when I talk to companies that realize what a burden that is and that they really want to work on that issue or similar diseases, that's encouraging to me, and I'm happy to see the industry engaging in those kind of conversations and really thinking more about that.
You should, of course, tell us what those stories that you're going to write will be before you leave here.
Right.
That would be.
Before you write, what are you going to write next year?
Aaron, do you have a favorite?
So when we were prepping for this, I misunderstood the question. So I don't have a clever anecdote of a story at JP Morgan other than me running in high heels, which seems to happen every year. And then I always, except this year, buy a new pair of shoes. I'm very thankful for the conveniently located DSW across from the St. Francis. One year I ended up having to buy not one, but two, because the first pair I bought was not good. And then the second pair, I just stopped after that, because even though they made my heel bleed, I just toughed it out for the rest of Biotech Showcase. See?
I do have a favorite.
It's
That's
true,
all I
Sarah.
have.
DSW would be a
Oh,
fantastic sponsor for you next
They
year.
would be. Yes.
We hear a lot of concern about the homeless here, as part of the dichotomy of what's going on in San Francisco during the Biotech Showcase, and the other meeting that's going on alongside this one. And I was lost and couldn't find a reception that I was going to on Monday night, and a very kind gentleman sitting on the street said, "Hey, are you looking for Bourbon and Branch? It's right there across the street."
Oh,
Was he one of our CEOs?
I don't know. But I was wondering if maybe they paid him.
Let's change gears over to what's happening at FDA. The pace of regulatory approvals, at least for some therapies, has increased. I think the latest was Bluebird last week was approved well ahead of its PDUFA date. There's been some criticism in the mainstream media that FDA has become too lax, approving drugs based on scant evidence. Do you agree? Erin, any thoughts?
Oh. No, I don't agree. I mean, I think that, I've followed, I'm going to focus on oncology for a second. I think FDA has evolved as the data and the growing patient voice has evolved, and our ability to access relevant data and information from patients. So, I can remember covering ODACs from 10 years ago, and sort of, it was, you have to show a PFS benefit of, however much to, get a drug approved. But I would say FDA has taken the patient voice into consideration more, but the drugs have changed. Rick Pazder actually has a quote of saying, "We haven't changed our standards. The drugs have changed. The drugs have gotten better." And I do largely think that is the case. So, and then, the fact that we now can access real-world evidence through the availability of databases and EMRs, and use that to help support regulatory filings for oncology, where you have synthetic control arms and whatnot from those sort of resources, which allows you to get a drug, single-arm trial, through FDA. And I think that should be welcomed. So no, I don't think it's slipped.
I think there's a grain of truth to it. So I don't think the FDA is approving drugs willy-nilly, but I do have a general sense that in many areas, maybe the bar's being lowered, but maybe a better way to say it is that I'm afraid they're not being tough enough. And not just whether drugs are approved or not. I'm worried that maybe some things that should be in labels aren't. And I do keep, I started doing this just the right time that I can think back to Vioxx and Avandia, which completely Vioxx, and also the SSRIs and the controversies over adolescent suicide rates. And what was striking in a lot of those examples is when the safety problems cropped up and completely changed the conversation about medicines, the worries were already there. And I am a little worried that we've gotten so used to not worrying about it because, they're all, they're rare diseases, they're areas where you can use ORR. I think that there has maybe some exaggeration in some of the stories that say, the FDA is just getting easier. And I do think that, I think we're still talking about the Sarepta decision a lot. And there are a lot of precedents that have been set. And right now, the prevailing political wind is so clearly in the direction of let's approve things. I'm worried what happens if that pushes too hard. And I'm also worried about something getting approved that shouldn't be approved and either doesn't really help patients or could harm them.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's hard for me to say one way or the other. I would honestly try to kick the can on that question until after aducanumab and see what happens with the I assume there will be an advisory committee if it is accepted for a review. I think that will be the biggest regulatory decision the FDA has in 2020 to make. And I do wonder when you think of Exondys and Vyondys with Sarepta and the FDA decisions there and the reversal on Vyondys, the role of patient advocacy and the influence that has had on the agency, if that will come into play when you're deciding on potentially approving the first Alzheimer's drug.
It's early days, but what are your expectations, if any, for the new FDA Commissioner, Stephen Hahn? Big sigh?
I think it's too early.
He did very quickly delete a tweet the other day.
I expect less action on both e-cigarettes and tobacco than we were all probably expecting a few years ago or a year ago.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, he doesn't have the background of Scott Gottlieb, where I think so much of Gottlieb's views were documented in some extent in white papers or his previous work. I haven't really seen that with Hahn, so I don't really know what to expect. I know it's not that long until the election, so how much action he can actually have on and influence he can have on the agency, and maybe a year until the election is to be determined, I guess.
Well, every year during the Biotech Showcase, trying to rack up my gold stars here, there's usually a theme or two that emerges that kind of sets the tone for the year. Mandy, what were the themes this year, or did anything materialize for you?
Well, on Monday, the theme was "Where are the deals?" I think as the meeting's gone on and companies have given their presentations and talked to investors and spoken at the Biotech Showcase, they have maybe alleviated some investor concern. I don't know. I actually haven't watched stocks that closely to see how things are going, but I think the overarching theme is we, for the most part, feel pretty good about where we are. This year, as you know, if you went to Amgen's presentation, Bob Bradway said, we are focused on execution, 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 and I think that's what it is. It's execution in the pipeline to make sure those pipelines that they feel good about meet their expectations, and it's focus on launches. A lot of companies have new drug launches to try and make up for drugs that went off patent, so those are going to be the things to watch. They want to keep the ship steady right now, and I think they're feeling fairly confident, which is good for companies that want to do deals with them, because they'll keep that money flowing and be able to keep investing. So.
There is one space where they can't necessarily execute on, though, and I think that's drug pricing reform.
Right.
And that comes up with every company, large and small. And consensus there seems to be that out-of-pocket caps in Medicare Part D are something they are vying for. Everybody wants to talk about rebate reform. I would pose the question to the audience if anybody thinks that has legs going into 2020, whether that's in the Senate Finance Committee bill or otherwise. But drug pricing reform is a headwind that's here to stay, like it or not, and I think we're going to have to wait and see how that plays out this year.
Mm-hmm. All right, well, I'd like to leave a little bit of time for questions, so get your questions in mind. But first, we'll do a little lightning round here. Bold prediction for the year. Will we see Biogen AD drug approved? The latest twist in the Theranos saga? What do you think, Andrew?
I am not that bold of a man to say the next Theranos is happening and here's the name. I'm going to go with a much less bold prediction, but I think it's a really interesting space that isn't talked about a lot. Platform trials and adaptive trials that sort of use a shared placebo group. There's one happening at Mass General and ALS that's kicking off the beginning of this year that takes drugs across the industry, a basket of 5 drugs across the industry, and shares one placebo arm. The design on it is really compelling from everyone I've talked to as far as just lowering the cost. Patients love it because there's a much lower chance of placebo, and companies can get on board with it because it's cheaper and there's a quick path to getting actual results from these studies. I think that's a tremendously fascinating area that's really grown in oncology, and I'm really curious to see this year if that can spread beyond oncology to other areas.
We haven't touched on this, but I think the Department of Justice's antitrust unit will continue to press forth on generic drug makers for price fixing. That's nearly a half-decade-long probe, and I think there's pressure from Washington, from Congress, to see the results of that long, drawn-out investigation that has had a lot of taxpayer dollars go into it. So I would say keep your eyes peeled and see how that impacts those stocks.
Matt?
It's not really a prediction, but, well, actually, I'll make it a prediction. I think that the public is not going to become worried about the safety of generic drugs, even though there's a lot of smoke and a lot of fire that maybe they should be this year. But as with the countervailing pressures on drug pricing, there's an increasing risk of a lot of the things we take as standard, and those would be my two examples, that we're getting into these environments, these situations where nothing changes and nothing changes and nothing changes for years and years, but when there's finally a change, it's going to be a big one.
Mandy?
Well, that's a tough one. I think in terms of financing, which we haven't really gotten around to talking about, we're going to see a lot of deals in the first half of the year and not a lot in the second half of the year, as the Biotech Showcase lunch panel spoke about today. Mm-hmm. But with the election uncertainty, that's going to throw things off in the second half of the year. But my analysis of IPO performance last year is the class of 2019 biopharma companies that went public. As of the third quarter, the average return was down. It was a loss. As of the end of the year, it was a 45% average return. So investors are interested. For good companies that go out, they're interested. Probably even for some not so great companies that go out, they're interested. They'll find money somehow or another, like they did last year. So, the financing will remain frothy. The first week of January, there were 20, I counted 20 VC deals, $20 million and up. That went all the way up to 125, I think. So I would imagine that's going to continue for quite some time, but slow in the second half.
I'm going to make two. They're not bold, because as has been said before on the panel, I am also not a bold individual. First, I think China.
Heels.
I run in heels. I will perhaps a third prediction. I may enter a high heel half marathon. But anyway, two things. I think China will continue to be very important. We saw the trade deal announced today. We've seen the CFIUS rules come out that have sort of clawed back some of the genetic material issues that could have really ensnared a lot of biotechs. That's happened this week during Bio Showcase, but not at Bio Showcase. Biotech Showcase.
It was almost here. It was almost here.
Okay, great. And so I think China will continue to be important, both U.S. companies going over there and Chinese companies coming here to market and launch their drugs. Second prediction will be we will see more biotechs so long as the capital markets stay robust, take their drugs commercial. I think you are seeing it more already. We ran a series of stories last year on the rise of the independents, biotechs taking their own drugs commercial. You've already seen some of that late last year. You're going to see more of it this year, and I think it will continue so long as the capital markets are strong, so long as there are good management teams that can steer these things through and onto the market. So there you go.
Sounds like it's going to be an exciting year. Questions for our panel? Welcome you to come up to the mic and introduce yourself and ask a question.
Sure, hi there. My name's David. I'm the CEO of Valisure. And I'd love to ask the question of the rest of the panel on Matthew's comment on generic drugs and the problems with generic drugs. I was actually pretty surprised by your comment to say that you think that consumers won't care. It was the cover of Bloomberg Business Week, Can You Trust Generics? And then a big picture of a pill that said nope on it. Rather provocative cover there. So maybe some of the other panelists, or maybe even to understand not just consumers, will the industry care about these growing problems with generics?
Yeah, if I can just add to that discussion, there's a book that's coming out. Well, it's actually been launched, but I think the big marketing push will happen in about March or April, called Bottle of Lies. And it's an undercover story that went on for 8, 9, 10 years about the FDA's inability to really cover and inspect facilities, in particular in this case in India, never mind China. Catherine Eban wrote it. Frankly, it is scary. The last entries were made as of January of this year. So it's, I don't know if you've heard of it. Yeah.
I was thinking of it. I should have mentioned it.
Yeah, I'm going to keep my comments short because I don't follow the generic industry too closely, but I think between that book and you know, just what we've seen as far as Anna Edney has really had her finger right on the pulse of this at Bloomberg. If that reporting continues and there's not some resolution from the FDA on what is causing these contaminations, I think it's a very legitimate public health issue.
I agree, and kudos to Anna Edney, that was her cover story, but I would actually point the question to the FDA and see what more there is to say
They don't
there.
have enough people on the ground to do what they need to do, period. They simply don't. When you give an organization 6 months, okay, and I'm making a statement now, sorry. When you give an organization, a pharma company or a generic manufacturer 6 months to get prepared for your visit, you're not really inspecting them on the fly. So, I mean, that boils down to the bottom. Okay, read the book.
Any more questions for the panel?
Anybody else? If not, please welcome me, join me in welcoming, thanking, you can tell it's been a long week, thanking our panelists for sharing their thoughts about everything that's gone on around Biotech Showcase, including that other meeting called JP Morgan and all the other meetings that have taken place. We appreciate those of you who persevere even with the shoe issue. And we give everybody gold stars for really trying to say Biotech Showcase a lot this year. Thank you so much for leading this discussion. We enjoyed it. Thank you. Okay, and I think now we have a reception taking place that started a few minutes ago. So to, at least for us, end this week.